brought away by a British army and urged that they be held only until they could be restored. And he was saying that in 1868. We didn't even know how to fix a UTI without leeches back then. But we knew that raiding other countries for their shit was deeply lamentable, which is British for super fucked up. Now, the second common argument is that objects are actually safer under the care of Western institutions than they would be in their home country. Here is that case being made by an art dealer regarding pre-Columbian art from Peru.
According to the law, which I like to think of as Solomon's law, the one who loves the baby best, the one who paid the most. If Peru cannot properly take care of its national treasure, the rest of the world will take care of it for the Peru, as it should be.
That man seems great. But you know what? He is right. It's exactly as King Solomon famously declared. The real mother is whoever agrees to offer $200,000 over the asking price all cash, inspection waived. But that argument, you can't be trusted with your own property, you'll just damage it, is hard to land even before you land. That the caretaking record of some museums is mixed at best. Remember that woman insisting that the Greeks couldn't possibly take care of the Parthenon monuments? Here is a fun fact. Multiple leaks have been reported in the British Museum's Greek galleries. And in the 1930s, in what museum officials later admitted was a heavy-handed attempt to clean the sculptures, they actively damaged them by scrubbing them with wire brushes and a harsh cleaning agent. So look, even under Solomon's law, whoever loves the baby gets the baby, but if you scrub the baby with wire brushes, we take the fucking baby away. And the final argument that you hear is that these museums are an open repository of the world's treasures and can actually increase the number of people who can enjoy them. But you've already seen someone point out that is only true if you can get to the museum in question. And also, it's worth noting that most display only a tiny fraction of their collections. The British Museum, for instance, has a collection of 8 million objects, although only around 80,000 of them, just 1%, are on public display at any one time. And it can be pretty galling for people to find that their heritage, which is often part of a vibrant present-day culture, is sitting in storage in the British Museum's underground loot prison. Here in the US, we've stashed away many Native American artifacts. And just watch as members of the Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho tribes are allowed to visit artifacts in storage at Chicago's Field Museum.
So, just beyond here is the storeroom, where we'll be looking at some of the artifacts.
When I think about objects that belong to tribal members that are just sitting there in the dark, I felt angry and I felt sad.
You just walk in and there's just like rows and rows and rows of all these objects.
They've been boxed away since they were collected. Nobody can see them, touch them, be around them.
That is devastating. And it gets a lot harder to pretend that these objects are fulfilling a mission of educating and connecting people when they're in a basement in a box labelled with a fucking Sharpie. And at this point, you may well be thinking, well, obviously we should have taken those objects in the past, but now we know better. But you should know, this practice is still very much going on. Which brings us to the second big part of our story, the modern antiquities market, because items are still being bought, sold and donated all the time between private individuals, museums, dealers and auction houses. And when it comes to those items, the key word to understand is provenance. Basically, the full history of an object and the path it took to end up here. Because not every piece is like those famous Benin bronzes where it is clear from our history books who took them. For most items, research into provenance is absolutely critical. It's not just how you know whether an item is real or fake, but also whether or not it got to you legally. The auction house Sotheby's even has a whole video on its website bragging about how much it loves researching provenance, even though it seems to view it as less an ethical imperative and more as a pretty sweet marketing perk.
So, provenance.
That's my favorite part.
Provenance is the history of ownership for a work.
Since it was brought to life.
Who that work of art had been made for.
Whose walls it's been hanging on.
how many different hands has it passed through?
Who else has looked at it? In some cases, who else has loved it?
Who wore it? When did she wear it? How did she wear it? How often did she wear it? For me, this is what we kind of live for, is to get the great stories to tell.
And often the story of its ownership can be just as interesting, if not more interesting, than the artist.
Provenance is something that, in a way, doesn't matter.
Yeah, and yet, in another way, it really does. A quick side note, never in my life has there been such an intimidatingly bougie collection of people. You can almost hear them saying, actually, it's pronounced croissant. And while I do not doubt that Sotheby's loves backstories that add lustre and, crucially, value to the objects that they auction, they and many others seem much less interested when those stories uncover something seamier. One gallery owner who recently pled guilty for her part in trafficking looted antiquities said that buying and selling objects with vague or even no provenance was so much the norm in the art market, it was a conspiracy of the willing. And to see exactly what that conspiracy can look like, just look at one attempted sale where Sotheby's ignored some pretty glaring warning signs.
3 years ago, Cambodia learned that Sotheby's auction house in Manhattan was attempting to sell a 1,000-year-old masterpiece for $3 million, the feet of which were still at the temple in Cambodia. Sotheby's was warned by the very expert they hired to appraise the statue that it was, quote, definitely stolen. They knew the feet were still there. Despite what their expert told them, they decided to put the statue on the front of one of their more prominent auction catalogs of the year.
Holy shit! How did that conversation go? The expert said, this is definitely stolen. And Sotheby said, yeah, but it might not be, right? And the expert said, no, it is stolen. And Sotheby said, you're so funny. And the expert said, I'm sorry, what? And Sotheby said, seriously, Jamie, you're too much. And the expert said, thanks, but again, it is stolen. And Sotheby said, tell your mum I said hi. And the expert said, my mum's actually dead. And then they printed it on the cover. Now, legally, I have to tell you, Sotheby's insist that they did nothing wrong and that they conduct extensive due diligence before offering items up for auction. But you should know, in the case of that statue, federal prosecutors eventually intervened, forcing Sotheby's to hand it over to Cambodia, where it was eventually happily reunited with its feet. It's a real Cinderella story, isn't it? If Cinderella had been amputated at the ankle. And interestingly, and to that point, it is not uncommon to see statues missing feet or hands. And while you might assume that it's damage due to time, it's often a sign that it has been stolen, with looters or thieves sawing off heads to sell separately, or hacking a sculpture out from a temple's wall so rapidly that they leave the feet behind. And if I know this, and you now know this, then Sotheby's definitely fucking did. And again, this is why provenance research is so vitally important. But many buyers fail to do even the bare minimum, meaning that the demand for stolen goods will always be met by a steady supply. Just watch as a dealer in Nepalese artifacts, Deepak Shakya, basically walks someone through just how easy it can be to get paperwork to justify removing an object from the country.
By law, the country's Department of Archaeology cannot issue export papers on items more than 100 years old. But Deepak says he has a tried and proven way.
So government, no problem getting these out?
I mean, we have to give some money to under table, otherwise, no problem.
Okay.
I mean, it's not legal.
Okay.
But still, I mean, we can get the stamp. It's no problem.
Okay, that is way too easy. I don't know how hard it should be to illegally export a culture's treasured antiquities, but it should at least be harder than find a guy who has a guy. That man was later arrested and charged, presumably alarming any museums with large collections from Nepal. And just look what happened when those documentary makers sat down with a representative from the Rubin Museum right here in New York to ask a pretty basic question.
In Nepal, authorities recently arrested a number of antique dealers. Has the Rubin Museum done any dealings with Deepak Shakya or his family, the Shakyas?
I don't think we should answer that, do we?
The museum's PR person intervenes.
You'd have to do a lot of research to know that.
Do you want to say that?
Do you want us to get back to you about it?
That would be, yeah, that'd be good.
Yeah.
Okay. A pretty good rule when you're asked, do you work with art thieves, is that any answer that's not an immediate no is instantly suspicious. And while the Rubin later claimed that, to their best knowledge, they didn't have any connection to Deepak Shakya or any objects from him, they did return these two objects from their collection just this year that were very much stolen, and the Nepalese group that pressured them to do that recently identified another object that they say is stolen, which, you will never guess, just happens to be in the Rubin right now. But don't worry, the Rubin told us they're looking into that one now too, and I'm sure they'll get back to us. After all, it's what they do. And the thing is, there are lots of dealers around who use museums to launder their reputations. Take Subhash Kapoor. He was once one of the leading sources of Asian art for museums and collectors. The Met currently has 86 objects from him in its collection, and even threw him a private reception in 2009 after he donated dozens of Indian drawings, which was a real win-win because the Met got the drawings and Kapoor got to tell people that he had art in the Met. And it's not like they would work with a disreputable dealer, right? But Kapoor was ultimately identified as a prolific trafficker of stolen goods, and he didn't even bother coming up with good cover stories. The most common one that he used was that objects had come from the family collection of his girlfriend.